Hello and welcome to another story that will take you into the past. This time we find ourselves in Germany before and shortly after the First World War. A time marked by rapid social change, economic instability, and the gradual breakdown of long-standing structures that had once provided order and predictability in everyday life. At the center of this story is Fritz Haarmann, a man who at first glance appeared to be an ordinary figure within the city of Hanover, but whose actions would later place him among the most notorious criminals of his time. Before we get into the story, a small warning. This story includes some difficult topics like violence and abuse, so just keep that in mind as you watch and listen. Fritz Haarmann was born in 1879 in Hanover as the youngest of 6 children, growing up in a household defined by imbalance rather than stability. His father was authoritarian, aggressive, and frequently unfaithful, while his mother was deeply indulgent toward him, creating a split environment of control on one side and protection on the other. From an early age, Haarmann was socially withdrawn, forming few connections outside his immediate family. He showed clear deviations from expected social behavior for boys at the time, preferring domestic activities such as sewing and cooking, and forming a particularly close attachment to his mother. This combination, social isolation, identity deviation, and emotional dependence, formed a distinct early pattern. Around the age of 8, he was sexually abused by a teacher, an event that was never fully explored or processed later in his life. At school, he was well behaved but academically weak, repeating years despite maintaining outward compliance. By adolescence, Haarmann had grown into a physically strong young man and completed his schooling in 1894. He briefly worked as an apprentice locksmith before entering a military academy at the age of 15, where he initially adapted well to the structured environment. However, this stability did not last. Within 5 months, he began experiencing sudden lapses of consciousness. These episodes were first interpreted as anxiety-related but later classified as a form of epilepsy-like condition. Following this diagnosis, he left the military and returned home, marking the first clear break between external structure and internal instability. Shortly after returning, at the age of 16, Haarmann committed his first known sexual offenses. His behavior followed a consistent method, targeting young boys, gaining their trust, and luring them into secluded environments such as cellars before abusing them. He was arrested in 1896, but rather than being processed through a standard legal framework, his case was redirected into the psychiatric system. After repeated offenses, he was institutionalized in 1897 in Hildesheim, where he was declared incurably deranged and unfit to stand trial. This decision removed him from legal accountability, but did not resolve the underlying pattern. Instead, it shifted responsibility from the judicial system to a medical one that ultimately failed to contain him. In 1898, Haarmann escaped from the institution, likely with assistance from his mother, reinforcing the persistent protective role she played throughout his life. He fled to Zurich, where he lived for approximately 16 months, working as a handyman in a shipyard. During this period, his life appeared outwardly stable. He maintained employment, integrated into a routine, and avoided immediate conflict with authorities. This phase suggests that under certain conditions, his behavior could remain temporarily contained, though not fundamentally altered. He returned to Hanover in 1899. Upon returning, Haarmann entered a relationship with a woman named Erna Lowert and became engaged to her. She soon became pregnant, marking a moment where his life appeared to align with conventional social expectations. At the same time, he received notice in 1900 to perform compulsory military service, placing him once again at the intersection of external structure and internal instability. Across these stages, a consistent pattern becomes visible. The early environment combined instability and protection, preventing clear behavioral boundaries from forming. Early warning signs, social isolation, unprocessed trauma, and identity conflict were present but not integrated into any corrective structure. The first major break occurred during adolescence, where neurological and psychological instability disrupted his ability to function within rigid systems like the military. Soon after, his behavior shifted into a repeated pattern of targeting vulnerable individuals. Institutionalization labeled him as irredeemable but failed to contain him, and his subsequent escape exposed a critical system failure. What followed was a temporary phase of normalization, where employment and relationships masked the persistence of underlying patterns. This creates a clear trajectory, not a sudden transformation, but a gradual formation of behavior shaped by environment, instability, and incomplete intervention. Fritz Haarmann entered military service in October 1900 when he was deployed to Weimar in Alsace as part of the 10th Rifle Battalion. During this period, he functioned at a high level, earning a reputation among his superiors as a disciplined and reliable soldier, as well as an excellent marksman. He would later describe these years as the happiest time of his life, suggesting that the structure and clarity of military life provided a form of stability that had been absent earlier. This stability, however, did not last. In October 1901, Haarmann collapsed during a training exercise, marking the beginning of a physical and neurological decline. He began experiencing recurring dizziness and was hospitalized for more than 4 months. By July 1902, he was formally discharged from the military, having been declared unsuitable for both service and work. His condition was described in medical terms as probable dementia praecox, an early classification associated with what would later be understood as schizophrenia. Following his discharge, Haarmann returned to Hanover and resumed living with his fiancée, Erna Lowert. He received a modest monthly pension from the military, which became his primary source of financial support. Despite this, his ability to reintegrate into civilian life remained limited. He briefly worked in his father's cigar factory, but soon initiated legal action against his father, claiming that his medical condition prevented him from working and that he was therefore entitled to financial support. This lawsuit was unsuccessful, as his father contested the claim and the charges were dismissed. The relationship between father and son deteriorated further, eventually escalating into a violent confrontation. Haarmann's father attempted to initiate legal proceedings against him, accusing him of making death threats and engaging in blackmail in an effort to have him returned to a mental institution. However, these accusations were also dismissed due to a lack of supporting evidence. In May 1903, Haarmann was ordered to undergo a new psychiatric evaluation. This examination resulted in a significantly different conclusion from earlier assessments. Although he was described as morally deficient, he was no longer considered mentally unstable. This marked a critical shift. Where he had previously been classified as incurably deranged and removed from legal responsibility, he was now viewed as capable of functioning within society, despite clear behavioral concerns. With financial assistance from his father, Haarmann and his fiancée attempted to establish a more stable life by opening a fishmongery. For a brief period, this represented a return to conventional social roles, combining work, partnership, and domestic structure. He also attempted to work as an insurance salesman, but these efforts were short-lived. In 1904, he was officially classified by the military authorities as disabled and unable to work, resulting in a slight increase in his pension. That same year, his engagement to Erna Lowert collapsed. While she was pregnant with his child, Haarmann accused her of being unfaithful, which led to the termination of their relationship. Because the fishmongery was registered in her name, she retained control of the business and forced him to leave. This period reveals a clear pattern of temporary stability, followed by repeated breakdown. The military provided a structured environment in which Haarmann was able to function effectively, but once that structure was removed, underlying instability resurfaced quickly. Medical diagnoses introduced ambiguity rather than clarity, shifting him between categories of illness and responsibility without resolving the core issues. Attempts at reintegration through work, legal claims, and personal relationships consistently failed. Each effort at normalization was followed by conflict, collapse, or exclusion, gradually reinforcing a trajectory away from stable social participation. Rather than a single turning point, this phase represents a cycle. Structure creates stability, its removal exposes instability, and each failed reintegration deepens the pattern. For the next decade, Fritz Haarmann lived primarily on the margins of legality, sustaining himself through petty theft, burglary, and fraud. Although he occasionally secured legitimate employment, these periods were consistently short-lived, as he repeatedly stole from employers or their customers. Beginning in 1905, he served a series of short prison sentences for offenses such as larceny, embezzlement, and assault, establishing a pattern of continuous minor criminal activity interrupted only by incarceration. At one point, while working as an invoice clerk, he became associated with a female colleague with whom he later claimed to have participated in grave and tombstone thefts between 1905 and 1913, although he was never formally charged for these acts. Despite the lack of prosecution in this instance, the broader pattern remained unchanged. Between 1905 and 1912, he spent the majority of his time either imprisoned or under investigation. In late 1913, Haarmann was arrested again, this time for burglary. A search of his residence uncovered a significant quantity of stolen property, linking him to multiple crimes beyond the initial charge. Although he denied responsibility, the evidence was sufficient for conviction, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for a series of burglaries and fraud-related offenses. During his imprisonment, the outbreak of World War I created a shortage of available labor within Germany. As a result, in the later years of his sentence, Haarmann was permitted to leave the prison during the day to perform manual labor on nearby estates, returning each evening. This arrangement provided him with limited freedom while maintaining formal confinement. He was released in April 1918. Following his release, Haarmann briefly relocated to Berlin before returning to Hanover, where he initially stayed with a relative before renting a small apartment. This transition coincided with a period of severe economic and social instability in Germany after the war. The early years of the Weimar Republic were marked by widespread poverty, increased crime, and the rapid expansion of black market activity. Haarmann himself later noted the extent of this poverty, and the environment provided immediate opportunities for someone already embedded in criminal behavior. He began operating around Hanover Central Station, trading in stolen goods and rebuilding connections within the local criminal network. Rather than representing a new phase, this was a direct continuation of his earlier pattern, now amplified by a system that had become weaker and more chaotic. Despite being known to authorities as both a repeat offender and a homosexual, Haarmann gradually established a working relationship with the police. He began acting as an informant, supplying information about criminal activities within Hanover's underground networks. This role was not incidental. It provided him with a strategic advantage. By offering to store or fence stolen goods, he could attract other criminals, then relay this information to the police, who would conduct coordinated raids. To avoid suspicion, he often allowed himself to be arrested alongside those he had betrayed, maintaining his cover within the criminal community. At the same time, he expanded his visible cooperation with law enforcement. He patrolled Hanover Station, reported illegal activities, and even carried out citizens' arrests for minor offenses such as forged travel documents. Through these actions, he gained the trust of the police, who increasingly viewed him as a reliable source of information. By 1919, Haarmann occupied a unique position. He was no longer simply a criminal operating outside the system. Instead, he had embedded himself within it, functioning simultaneously as offender and informant. This dual role gave him 3 critical advantages: access to vulnerable individuals in a high-traffic environment, protection from suspicion due to his cooperation with authorities, and control over the flow of information between criminal networks and the police. What had once been a pattern of repeated arrest and release had now transformed into something more stable and more dangerous. The system that had previously attempted to contain him had, in effect, begun to rely on him. Between 1918 and 1924, Fritz Haarmann carried out a series of murders that followed a consistent and methodical pattern. He is known to have killed at least 24 victims, although the true number is believed to be higher. All of his victims were young males, typically between the ages of 10 and 22, with most in their mid to late teens. His method relied on access and deception rather than force. He approached vulnerable individuals, often runaways or youths without stable support, and lured them with offers of help, shelter, work, or even under the pretense of police authority. Once inside his apartment, the interaction initially appeared normal. The victims were given food and drink, and the situation was framed as temporary safety. The moment of violence came suddenly. Haarmann typically strangled his victims while simultaneously biting into their throat, an act he later referred to as his love bite. In many cases, death resulted from asphyxiation, although in some instances he bit through the throat completely, severing critical structures. After the murders, the bodies were systematically dismembered. Most of the remains were disposed of in the nearby Lane River, allowing evidence to disperse and reducing the likelihood of discovery. In a few cases, alternative methods were used, such as burial or disposal in a lake, but the overall pattern remained consistent. Haarmann also retained and redistributed the victims' belongings. Clothing and personal items were either kept for himself and his associate or sold through established black market channels. In some instances, these items were even passed on as gifts, further obscuring their origin and integrating them into everyday circulation. Following his arrest, rumors circulated that Haarmann consumed the flesh of his victims or sold it disguised as pork or horse meat. No direct evidence ever confirmed these claims. However, he was known to trade in illegal meat, which was often processed, boneless, and difficult to trace. This overlap between his crimes and his economic activity contributed to the persistence of these suspicions, even if they could not be proven. The first known victim was a 17-year-old boy named Friedel Roth, who disappeared in September 1918. Witnesses reported that he had last been seen with Haarmann, leading police to search his residence. During the raid, Haarmann was discovered in the company of a semi-naked 13-year-old boy, resulting in his arrest and conviction for sexual assault. He received a 9-month prison sentence. However, this intervention did not uncover the full extent of his actions. Haarmann later admitted that, at the time of the search, Roth's remains were already hidden inside the apartment, undetected by investigators. In 1919, Haarmann met Hans Grans, an 18-year-old runaway. What began as a chance encounter quickly developed into a close and complex relationship. Grans moved into Haarmann's apartment, becoming both his lover and his accomplice. Their relationship introduced a new dynamic. Grans was described as manipulative and at times dismissive, while Haarmann appeared emotionally dependent, seeking approval and companionship. Despite conflicts between them, the relationship persisted, reinforcing Haarmann's existing behavior rather than interrupting it. After serving his sentence between 1920 and 1921, Haarmann once again established himself as a police informant. Despite his criminal record and prior conviction, he regained the trust of law enforcement and resumed providing information on criminal activity in Hanover. This position gave him increased mobility and reduced suspicion. He was able to operate in public spaces, particularly around the central railway station, with a degree of legitimacy that further enabled his access to potential victims. In 1921, Haarmann and Grans moved into an apartment on New Strasse, located near the Lane River. This location became the central site for his activities, combining proximity to victims, access to disposal routes, and a stable base of operations. At this stage, the pattern had fully stabilized. The method, the environment, and the system surrounding him all aligned. He had access to victims, a controlled space to carry out his actions, a disposal mechanism, and a degree of protection through his relationship with the police. What emerges from this period is not randomness, but consolidation. The violence followed a repeatable structure. The economic layer allowed stolen goods to circulate without immediate suspicion. The relationship with Grans reinforced the behavior rather than disrupting it. Most critically, the connection to law enforcement created a protective layer that reduced external pressure. The system had not only failed to stop him, it had in effect created the conditions in which his actions could continue with increasing consistency and reduced risk. By 1923, Fritz Haarmann had established a highly consistent method of identifying and targeting victims. Most of those he approached were young males, typically between the ages of 13 and 20, many of whom were runaways, commuters, or individuals searching for work. Hanover Central Station became the central point of contact, providing a constant flow of vulnerable individuals who could be approached without drawing immediate suspicion. His approach relied on controlled deception rather than force. He presented himself as someone who could offer assistance, employment, or temporary shelter, and in some cases adopted the role of an authority figure, using a false identity as a detective to gain compliance. This allowed victims to follow him voluntarily, reducing the need for overt coercion and maintaining the appearance of normal interaction. During this period, Hans Grans played an increasingly active role. He was not merely present, but in several cases, directly involved in identifying potential victims or influencing their selection. Some victims were chosen based on practical factors, such as the quality of their clothing, which could later be sold or reused. This introduced a secondary layer to the crimes, where economic value became integrated into the selection process. The relationship between Haarmann and Grans reinforced the pattern rather than disrupting it. Their interactions created a closed system in which behavior was repeated, supported, and normalized within their shared environment. After luring victims to his residence, Haarmann followed a consistent sequence. The victims were killed, their bodies dismembered, and the remains disposed of, most often in the Lane River. This method minimized the risk of detection, as the flowing water reduced the likelihood of complete recovery. At the same time, the victims' belongings were retained and redistributed. Clothing, personal items, and other possessions were either used directly, sold through black market contacts, or given away. This integration of stolen goods into everyday circulation further obscured the connection between disappearance and crime. Throughout 1923, the number of victims increased and the time between murders shortened. Even after relocating to a new apartment in June of that year, the pattern continued without interruption, indicating that the behavior was no longer dependent on a specific location, but on a stable internal system. By late 1923, the frequency of disappearances had become noticeably higher. Haarmann operated with increasing confidence, approaching victims openly in public spaces and maintaining his routines without significant concealment. Evidence linking victims to him, such as clothing and personal belongings, accumulated yet did not immediately result in intervention. In 1924, the pattern reached its peak. Killings occurred in rapid succession, sometimes involving individuals Haarmann had already encountered or identified in advance. The process became more efficient, with little variation in method, suggesting a fully established routine. At the same time, his behavior reflected a growing sense of control. He discouraged acquaintances from reporting missing individuals and continued to operate within familiar public environments, indicating that the risk of detection was either underestimated or mitigated by his position and experience. The final known victim, a 17-year-old named Erich de Vries, was killed in June 1924. His remains were dismembered and transported in multiple stages before being disposed of, demonstrating both the persistence of the established method and the increasing logistical demands of the process. By this stage, the pattern had become fully stabilized. Victim selection, method of approach, execution, disposal, and post-crime handling all functioned as a single continuous system. The environment provided a steady supply of targets. The relationship with Grans reinforced behavior, and the lack of effective intervention allowed the pattern to continue uninterrupted. What began as isolated acts had evolved into a repeatable structure, sustained over time with increasing efficiency and reduced resistance from the surrounding system. In May 1924, the pattern that had remained hidden for years began to surface. On 17 May, a human skull was discovered near the Lane River. It belonged to a young male and bore clear signs of knife wounds. Despite this, the initial reaction from authorities was cautious and uncertain. Rather than immediately treating the discovery as evidence of murder, alternative explanations were considered, including the possibility of grave robbing, a medical prank, or that the remains had been carried from another location. This uncertainty did not last long. 2 weeks later, a second skull was found in close proximity to the first, again belonging to a young male. Soon after, a sack containing numerous human bones was discovered nearby. By mid-June, additional skulls were recovered, one belonging to a teenager, another to a younger boy, and all showed signs of deliberate separation from the body using a sharp instrument. In one case, there was even evidence of scalping. These discoveries did not occur in isolation. For more than a year, rumors had circulated in Hanover about the growing number of missing children and teenagers. The repeated findings of human remains gave these rumors a new level of credibility. Newspapers began to draw attention to the unusually high number of disappearances between 1918 and 1924, and the idea that these cases might be connected started to take hold. On 8 June, several hundred residents gathered near the river and began searching the surrounding area themselves. Their efforts led to the discovery of additional bones, which were then handed over to the authorities. Faced with mounting evidence, the police shifted their approach. They ordered a full search of the section of the Lane River running through the city. As the river was systematically dragged, the scale of the situation became clear. More than 500 human bones and body fragments were recovered. Medical examination revealed that these remains belonged to at least 22 individuals. Many of the bones showed signs of deliberate cutting, particularly at the joints, indicating systematic dismemberment. Some remains had been in the water for a long time, while others were more recent, suggesting that the activity had been ongoing over an extended period. A significant proportion of the remains were identified as belonging to young males, reinforcing the growing suspicion that a specific group had been targeted. As the evidence accumulated, attention turned toward a known figure within the local criminal landscape, Fritz Haarmann. He was already familiar to the police, with a long history of convictions that included offenses against minors. He had also been connected indirectly to earlier disappearances, including that of a teenage boy in 1918. At this point, the pattern that had previously gone unrecognized began to align with an individual already known to the system. Despite this growing suspicion, Haarmann's position was complicated. He was not only a known offender, but also a trusted police informant who had provided valuable intelligence in the past. This dual role made direct action difficult. Instead, the authorities chose to observe him. On 18 June 1924, surveillance operations began. Because Haarmann was well known to local officers, undercover policemen from Berlin were brought in to monitor his movements without raising suspicion. This moment represents a shift from absence to visibility. For years, individual disappearances had not been connected. Evidence existed, but it remained fragmented, interpreted in isolation, or dismissed through alternative explanations. Only when physical remains accumulated to a scale that could no longer be ignored did the underlying pattern become undeniable. The delay was not caused by a lack of signals, but by the way those signals were interpreted. Even then, the central figure had already been present within the system, known, documented, and in contact with authorities. What changed was not the existence of the pattern, but the threshold at which it could no longer be overlooked. By June 1924, suspicion had already begun to form around Fritz Haarmann, but the decisive moment came through direct observation. On the night of 22 June, undercover officers watched him at Hanover Central Station. He was seen arguing with a 15-year-old boy named Karl Fromm, before approaching police and attempting to have the boy arrested on accusations of traveling with forged documents. What followed shifted the entire case. After his arrest, the boy revealed that he had been living with Haarmann for several days and had been repeatedly sexually assaulted, sometimes under the threat of a knife. This testimony provided immediate grounds for action, and Haarmann was arrested the following morning. A search of Haarmann's apartment revealed a level of evidence that could no longer be dismissed. The walls, floors, and bedding were heavily stained with blood. Haarmann attempted to explain this by claiming it was the result of his involvement in illegal meat trading, but this explanation quickly became untenable as further details emerged. Neighbors and former tenants described a consistent pattern. They had seen numerous young boys entering his residence, often without being seen leaving. Others reported observing Haarmann carrying sacks and bags late at night or in the early morning, and in some cases following him to the river, where he was seen discarding heavy bundles into the water. Inside the apartment and among his associates, police found large quantities of clothing and personal belongings. These items were displayed publicly, and families of missing youths were invited to identify them. Over time, more and more objects were recognized as belonging to sons and relatives who had disappeared. Haarmann attempted to deflect these connections by claiming that the items came from his second-hand clothing trade or from consensual encounters. However, this explanation began to collapse as specific cases were tied directly to him. The turning point came with the identification of belongings belonging to an 18-year-old named Robert Witzel. His clothing, boots, and keys were found in Haarmann's possession, and a skull previously discovered was identified as his. A witness also confirmed seeing Witzel in Haarmann's company shortly before his disappearance. Confronted with this convergence of evidence, Haarmann's resistance broke. Under pressure and with encouragement from his sister, Haarmann confessed. He admitted to raping, killing, and dismembering numerous young men between 1918 and 1924. He claimed that the killings were not planned, but rather the result of overwhelming impulses, particularly an urge to bite into the victim's throat while strangling them. Despite describing the dismemberment process as physically and emotionally unpleasant, he acknowledged that it followed each Arabic half, Arabic ta, Arabic lamb as a necessary step. The process was systematic and methodical, often taking up to 2 days to complete. Bodies were dismantled, organs removed, flesh separated, and remains disposed of through the river or other means. Haarmann claimed that he had killed between 50 and 70 victims, although the police were only able to link him to 27 disappearances. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his statements. While he portrayed the murders as impulsive, evidence suggested that some had been prepared in advance, including the creation of explanations for victims' disappearances and efforts to discourage others from reporting them missing. He also appeared selective in his confessions, admitting only to crimes for which evidence had already been uncovered and hinting at additional victims beyond those officially recognized. At the same time, his accomplice Grans was arrested and charged with involvement in the crimes. The broader system that had once allowed Haarmann to operate through his role as an informant and his familiarity with law enforcement had now fully turned against him. A psychological evaluation later determined that he was mentally competent to stand trial. This phase represents the point where concealment became impossible. For years, fragments of evidence had existed without being connected. Disappearances, rumors, and isolated findings had failed to form a coherent picture. What changed was not the nature of the crimes, but the accumulation of evidence to a level that forced recognition. The exposure was triggered not by a new type of behavior, but by the convergence of testimony, physical evidence, and identifiable victims. Once these elements aligned, the structure that had allowed the pattern to persist collapsed rapidly. The same system that had once overlooked or even relied on Haarmann was now confronted with the full scale of what had been taking place within it. The trial of Fritz Haarmann and Grans began on 4 December 1924. Haarmann was charged with the murder of 27 boys and young men who had disappeared between September 1918 and June 1924. In 14 of these cases, Haarmann acknowledged his guilt, although he claimed to be uncertain of the identification of the remaining 13 victims. Grans pleaded not guilty to charges of being an accessory to murder in several of the murders. Initially, following a thorough security search, all members of the public were permitted access to the courtroom. By the third day, the judge excluded all spectators from the courtroom, as each murder was discussed in detail due to the ongoing carnal and gruesome nature of the revelations. The trial was one of the first major modern media events in Germany and received extensive international press coverage. It was described as the most revolting case in German criminal history, with sensational headlines continuously appearing in the press. Haarmann was referred to by titles such as the Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, the Wholesale Murderer, and the Wolf Man. Although Haarmann denied any premeditation in the crimes, he remained adamant that the ultimate reason he killed was a mystery to him. He confessed to having killed 14 of the victims for whose murder he was tried and admitted to retaining and selling many of their possessions. However, he denied having sold the body parts of any of his victims as contraband meat. A medical expert later testified that none of the meat found in Haarmann's apartment was human. When asked to identify photographs of his victims, Haarmann became taciturn and dismissive, typically claiming to be unable to recognize them. In instances where he could not recognize faces but belongings were found in his possession, he would shrug and make comments such as, "I probably killed him," or "Charge it to me, it's all right with me." For example, when asked to identify a photograph of Alfred Haugreff, Haarmann stated that he assumed he had killed him, but did not remember his face. Numerous exhibits were introduced into evidence in the opening days of the trial, including 285 sections of skeletal remains, particularly skulls and thigh bones. These remains were recovered from the Lane River and determined to belong to young men under 20 years of age. Other items included the bucket used to store and transport remains, as well as the blood-stained bed upon which many of the victims had been killed. Haarmann denied that any of the skulls belonged to his victims, stating that he had almost always destroyed them and had thrown only one undamaged skull into the river. Several acquaintances and criminal associates testified for the prosecution, including former neighbors who had purchased meat from Haarmann. They noted that he often left his apartment carrying packages of meat, but rarely arrived with them. His landlady testified that he regularly boiled chopped pieces of meat and strained fat from what he claimed was pork, storing it in bottles. On one occasion in April 1924, his landlady and her family became ill after eating sausages he had provided. Another neighbor testified to the number of youths entering Haarmann's apartment but rarely leaving, believing that he was selling them to the Foreign Legion. Another witness stated that he had seen Haarmann dispose of bones in the Lane River. Two female acquaintances of Hans Grans also testified about an incident in 1923 when they discovered what they believed to be a human mouth in a cooking pot. They reported this to the police, but were told it may have been a pig's snout. By the second week of the trial, testimony was introduced about what the police had known regarding Haarmann's activities after his release from prison in 1918. The police had not suspected him in the disappearances of boys and young men, even though some of the victims had last been seen in his company and despite his prior criminal record. The trial of Fritz Haarmann concluded rapidly, lasting less than 2 weeks despite the testimony of nearly 200 witnesses. On 19 December 1924, the court delivered its verdict. Haarmann was found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders for which he had been charged and was sentenced to death by beheading. He was acquitted in 3 cases that he continued to deny. Upon hearing the sentence, Haarmann showed no resistance. He accepted the verdict without appeal, stating that his execution would serve as atonement for his crimes. He also acknowledged that if released, he believed he would likely kill again, reinforcing the perception that his behavior had followed a pattern he did not expect to change. Hans Grans was also judged guilty, though his role was treated differently. He was convicted of incitement to murder in one case and sentenced to death, while in another case he was found guilty as an accessory and received an additional prison sentence. The evidence against him included witness testimony placing him at the scene, and a written note indicating his involvement in the acquisition of a victim's belongings. Unlike Haarmann, Grans reacted with visible distress. He became hysterical upon hearing the sentence and collapsed after returning to his cell. His later appeal was unsuccessful. Haarmann chose not to challenge the court's decision. He declined to seek mercy or delay the outcome, presenting his death as both inevitable and justified. His statements reflected a form of acceptance rather than resistance, emphasizing accountability while maintaining a degree of emotional detachment. On the morning of 15 April 1925, Haarmann was executed by guillotine in the courtyard of Hanover prison. In accordance with tradition, he was informed of the exact date of his execution only the evening before. In his final hours, he met with a pastor and fulfilled simple last requests, including a cigar and coffee. Witness accounts described him as pale but composed, maintaining control over his demeanor as he approached the execution. His final words acknowledged his guilt and expressed repentance, but he also stated that he did not fear death. The final phase of the case reflects a sharp contrast between duration and resolution. For years, the pattern of crimes had developed without decisive interruption, supported by gaps in recognition and response. Once exposed, however, the system moved quickly. The trial was brief, the verdict definitive, and the sentence final. The outcome did not introduce new information, but rather consolidated what had already been revealed. The same individual who had operated within and around the system for years was now fully defined by it, and the process concluded with a form of absolute closure. What had been prolonged and fragmented ended abruptly, not through gradual correction, but through a single, irreversible decision. In summary, the case of Fritz Haarmann was not defined by a lack of information, but by a failure to connect the information that already existed. During the years in which the murders took place, there were many warning signs. People had reported missing individuals. Witnesses had seen victims with Haarmann. He also had a known criminal history involving similar offenses. However, these pieces of information were treated as separate incidents. They were not recognized as part of a larger pattern. It was only after human remains were discovered in the Lane River that the situation began to change. As more bones were recovered, the scale and consistency of the crimes became clear. This physical evidence forced authorities to reconsider earlier assumptions. It led directly to surveillance, arrest, and prosecution. The case is often used as an example of the limits of early 20th century police investigations. It shows the difficulty of connecting fragmented evidence, especially in missing persons cases. It also highlights the risks when an individual is close to law enforcement while still engaging in criminal activity. Once the evidence was fully recognized, the process moved quickly. The investigation, trial, conviction, and execution followed in a short period of time. This reflects a shift from long uncertainty to decisive action once enough evidence had been brought together.